Let's start. This sounds like to me like a weird scenario where, when you're in a conference and you have almost the same amount of people presenting and the same amount of people attending. But that's fine. We knew it would be a small group. We want to keep it very informal. I think we've been doing research, qualitative research, for like decades now. I don't want to put an age or anything, but a couple of decades or so. So we just want to talk about some of the hard lessons we learned doing qualitative research, and in particular talking about designing a strong interview guide and doing some relevant data analysis. Very informal conversation. This presentation is shaped by our experience, but also by our research interest. So you see some of our teams and some of our research background coming out. That's it. Oh, this is so dark. I think we'll present first, and then we give you like 10-15 minutes to ask questions. But if you have questions when we are presenting, I think it's fine, right? That you just say, oh, I have this question, I want to learn more about this, I totally didn't understand that. Let's keep it simple. So first, an overview of qualitative research. Answer the questions of how or why, the process, and also the causes. I think that's very important to understand that. It's an inductive process and it's open. You build the concepts, the hypotheses, the theories from the analysis and the data. It's grounded in the data, and that's why it's so important to be very mindful about your research design, the problem, the questionnaire, and the analysis. You can see everything here. But I think the main point for me talking about qualitative research is that you don't have the same structure that you would have in an experimental design. It's like George Foreman says with the grill, set it and forget it. You have an experimental design, you have two arms, think about a randomized controlled trial. You decide that, you define that, set it. Qualitative research is a process. It's an iterative. You think about the problem, you change the question, then you think about the questions, you decide the interview guide, and you keep changing things as you learn more and you have new questions or new problems. You really need the structure. And you really have to have a very strong design from the get-go, because you need to make changes, and it's good that you know what are you changing. And for that, you need a strong research design and an awareness of the complexities of doing research.
Yeah, I mean, and I think another thing to consider is like this importance of like, you're not testing a hypothesis, so it's okay to say, oh, like this thing that I thought was very interesting actually doesn't pan out for my participants. I've learned everything that I need to learn about this, but oh, this other thing popped up and I think I'm going to go down that route. And so this idea of like thinking and reflecting, taking field notes, analyzing those field notes, and your reactions to the work and the doing of the work is equally important, right? Like that's where some of the most thoughtful discussions can happen. And I think, Faith talked a little bit about this yesterday. I mean, I missed it, but I know some of what she says is that like that personal praxis and reflecting on what are your values, your biases, the way in which you may be similar or different to your participants, like that reflection on yourself is incredibly important to the work.
It's fine to start with a question, a problem, and end up answering a different question, answering the question and define it in the context of a larger problem or a different body of literature or theoretical framework. You don't have to be, and I think it's not good that you are too attached to anything when you're doing qualitative research. Think about your data first, and think about getting good data that would speak to you. It's a joke. Meaning, making is central to social life and social inquiry. So we want to understand the meanings behind the actions, and in the particular context in which people do things. It's not detached. When you ask a survey, age, or whatever, you are not thinking this person is in Nebraska or is in New York, but we're thinking about somebody using drugs and thinking about fentanyl and overdose risk, for example. Well, it's not the same thing rural Puerto Rico than rural Vermont, or so. Thinking about meaning and context is key.
And I think another thing that this allows you to do is to like explore the contexts that are different and how these different situational contexts may impact the way in which your participants are interacting with their friends, their lovers, the people that they buy and sell drugs to, and the context of their lives, right? Like each interaction, each set of behaviors could be very, very different depending on with whom the person is, or where they are, or who they think is in the room, etc. And so qualitative research really allows you to explore like the motivations and the way in which people are like synthesizing information in their world. And I think it's really, because the people that we work with for the most part, right, like life is not a buffet for them. Like they can't just like walk around and make every choice that they want to make, right? It's constrained. It's not a buffet for most of us, right? Mm-hmm. We can't just choose anything. But in particular, the people that we work with, right, like their lives are very, very constrained. And I think most people are rational actors. And so it allows you to understand the ways in which people are like making these choices that might not make sense to other people. But I don't think most people are just doing things willy-nilly, right? And so it's a really cool opportunity to explore that.
That's a good point. That social life looks disorganized and crazy and sometimes irrational. But if we think that social life is rational, has no structure, there's no point studying it. No, there's grounded rationalities. People try to make rational decisions in constrained situations, and that's what we want to understand, the meanings that are generated in these very extreme and challenging conditions. Mm-hmm. So when should qualitative research occur? In different moments. You could use it as a lead. In parallel, you do qualitative research first, and then that gives you a more textured understanding of the main variables that may then be employed to do a large survey, for example. You can do parallel. Qualitative components occur at the same time. You could be follow. You do qualitative, and then you can follow quantitative approaches. First you do quantitative and then you do qualitative, or you could do first qualitative and then you do quantitative. You can do it at the same time, or you can do it alone. I'm an ethnographer, so I've been using ethnographic methods alone, but I also use almost all the others as well. In my research in Puerto Rico, I work with social networks and HIV risk with injectors, and that was a very large study, so that was that.
Yeah, and I mean, I just got my first RCT, and like for me, I'm working with a bunch of like clinical psychologists, and they are really great at the study design, right? Like we're going to identify these mediators and these moderators, and they're going to use mediation to try and understand like, how this intervention worked, and moderation to try and understand for whom the intervention worked. And I was like, can't we just talk to people? Like, couldn't we just sit down and like really ask them? And we could sample based on like different levels of distress at the beginning of the study, and then kind of see how those people did as opposed to, in comparison. So I think that, I love it in terms of like trying to unpack the like why did this work, or how did it make a difference? But you're the ethnographer, and so people, I think it's really important, especially for your MRPs, to think about how you want to employ these methods, why, and then what will make it like really feasible for you. And so a standalone study is like a great option as well.
Can I be the peanut gallery for a second?
Yeah.
So how many of you have a qualitative design? There's 1, 2,
I imagine
3, 4 of you, right?
Yeah.
So is everybody doing a qualitative design? Is that part of the mandate?
No.
Okay.
No mandate.
It's just that it's small and that's what you can do. Okay. And how many of you have done a qualitative study before?
Oh, so that's good.
That's good. You can always learn. There are so many pitfalls in qualitative research because there's not a fixed, like an experimental design. So there are so many things that can go wrong if you don't pay attention. On the other hand, you cannot screw up a qualitative research design because it's interactive. So, and it's changing all the time according to new situations, new questions, new data. So if you pay attention to the process and you're mindful and reflective, you can always correct. It's not like a research design that you have these 2 arms and then, oh wow, half of the population of one arm died. I'm screwed. I mean, you have no data there. You can always change and revise, but you have to be mindful of the process. Mm-hmm. So you need a very strong sense of what's out there. You don't want to rediscover the wheel. So to formulate the problem, you really need to know what's out there already, what has been done. And experience working with a community members and stakeholders and spending time off the field, it's invaluable. Depending of your, place in your career, you might not have a lot of experience working with a particular population, and then relying on stakeholders, it might be a good approach. And also ask for mentorship and guidance from people that have been researched in the same topics in the same area, if possible.
I mean, I do think that like that the field work is particularly important. I think that you might, through your literature review, identify what is a really salient scientific gap. But if you're not working with your community members to understand the relevance of that gap to them, I think it's kind of a pitfall. And I know with the MRP, and I know you guys are so busy as assistant professors, the tendency can be to hire a research assistant to do everything for you. And I just don't.
No.
Don't do it.
Yeah, don't do it. Don't do it. I mean, I think, spending time in the field with the people who are working with your people, it's going to be really critical, not only for validating your data in terms of a stakeholder engagement process, but also just to make sure that you're asking the right questions.
And not only that, and that brings me to the next point. Thank you for that. The central research questions, and that's important. They are not what you're asking participants about. Your research questions do not translate automatically to the participants. Let's say I have a project on barriers to access to medically assisted treatment in Nebraska. You can also ask, what are the barriers you face? I mean, that translates okay, not great, but it's okay. But some of the questions they say about stigma or other issues that are more complex or more abstract do not translate well. Your research question is your research question. You have to find ways of operationalize and measure or gather evidence to answer that question, and that's a different process. A great way of beginning the question is how, the process. Tell me how. Explore, understand, and discover. You have to specify the phenomenon you plan to explore, identify the participants on the research side. There's a time component, brief, clear, and it should ideally fill a gap in the literature.
So you guys are all doing qualitative research, so you may not need this guidance if you go to the next slide. But here's an example of a relatively strong qualitative central research question, which is important, I think, to really to sort of be able to focus your research back to what is it that I'm trying to do again? What was the purpose? And so this is just an example of the question that's identifying the topic, which here is marital relationships, the period in time after a particular program was completed, the perspective of the people of interest, so men who participated in this marriage enrichment course, right? Clear, simple, somebody cares about that question.
Yeah.
But you're not going to sit down with men in an interview and say, how do you characterize your marriage? Can you take that next step of saying how you would start to talk to them? Because I think that
we'll do that we have 3
kind of
slides with 3 different examples.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'll do that we'll do that in a minute.
Yeah.
So, but about the in qualitative research, the semi-structured interview is critical. So how to design a good interview script or a good focus group guide. Avoid overkill, not 20, 30, 40 questions, a minimal number of questions, say 10, maybe 15. Consider that the academic terms are awful, do not translate well, need cultural translation. The interview guide should borrow language from the population you are studying. And you're like, yes, how do I do that? You have to be in the field. That's why you need to be there to understand how people talk about these things. In Puerto Rico, the only people that said cocaine are the cops. So if you say, are you injecting cocaine, you sound like an asshole. It's perico, right? And heroin is droga, like drug. Like the drug, droga. So it's droga and perico. It's not heroin and cocaine. So how they talk about everything related to injection use, the highs, the ups, the downs, everything, the withdrawal, the craving. They have words for that. And you cannot go and rely on an academic language for that, because it detaches you from them, detaches you from their experience. It creates a barrier. It might create mistrust, not necessarily mistrust, but it creates this barrier. You have to talk the language they talk, and then you translate to the academic audience. But for that, you have to be there. You cannot rely on an even native research assistant. You have to be there. And also the way of knowing how things go and how to correct and how to reflect on the the data collection process and how everything is going is by being involved. Just waiting 6 months for the data to come and start doing the coding. At that time, it's too late. I said, and we said, I think we agreed that qualitative research is flexible, it's interactive, it's amazing, it produces so many good quality data, but you have to be mindful of the pitfalls. If you sit too long, you are too far away. You know, once you collected the data, it's over. You cannot go back, you cannot do anything. So you have to be mindful from the beginning of all these issues.
I think the other part about the cultural translation piece is really thinking about the quality of the transcripts that you get back. So if you're using like students to transcribe or you're paying someone to transcribe, it's like absolutely critical with that somebody with that cultural knowledge go back through and quality check all of those.
Do some interviews yourself.
Yeah.
You know, I never have any questions about my data because I know I did, if not most, some of the interviews. I'm gonna go to Puerto Rico after this seminar and spend there 3 weeks. It's not that I don't trust my research assistant. He's brilliant. I wanna do my interviews. I always want, if I can. Avoid the yes/no questions. If it sounds, sorry about this, Brian, if your interview process sounds like a police interrogation, did you kill him? Where were you at when the person died? Yes/no questions are no good questions because it shuts everything down. You want the openness, and we're going to give you some examples of that. Offer prompts, pre-test if you can, edit and repeat. I have an example about stigma. There's a big topic now in research. There's a lot of funding. It means there's a lot of interest, and it's like a ball that keeps rolling and rolling. So, what's the best way of inquiring about participants' experience of stigma? And I had 2 questions. Do you feel stigmatized while seeking X? Let's say, do you feel stigmatized while seeking access to treatment, medical assisted treatment in Puerto Rico or whatever? That's one way of asking the question. Which of course is awful because it's, do you feel stigmatized while seeking treatment? Is yes or no. That's it. What about asking, can you tell me of any negative experiences while seeking treatment or X? What happened? How did this experience make you feel? I love that question because people have feelings, especially when they're discriminated or marginalized. They're powerful events that elicit powerful emotions. So it's not that I bought ice cream. How do you feel? Man. I was seeking treatment and I went there and they said no. They saw it was an injector, that it was coming like repeatedly, and they said, we can treat you. How do you feel? Like shit, because I thought I would die. Tell me a little bit about how you responded when X happened, with the discrimination or the event happened. Do you think that the same thing might have happened to other people? Good. Did the experience make you change anything in relation to the way you see or you seek treatment or X in the future? Some questions, it's not, some questions.
And I actually love the prompt, like, tell me a little bit about, and I think one of the ways that it can be really useful is like, so think, like a whole way to set this up, right? You don't want to talk too much, but like, think back to the last time that you went to seek X service, like, and try and really get yourself into that moment. And can you tell me a story about, can you tell me a little bit about, to get people to realize, like, what you really want to hear is something like, long and thoughtful and creative, and that they have the reins to speak however that, that they want. So.
People have trouble with abstract ideas like stigma. Because you don't think in terms of stigma. You are going through all this discrimination and bullshit, and but you know what you go through. So people know about their experiences, and that's why it's important that you can always situate them in the context, in the moment, and like you said, Alex, show me what happened the last time. How do you feel? Etc. Walk me through. I like the idea of walk me through. Tell me how it was, And also, you went there. I'm an anthropologist. I like the materiality of things. I like to understand the context. If I'm not there, I want to be able to recreate that. And so for that, you have to ask people how it was. Tell me what happened. Who was there? And you have the dietary self-efficacy.
Oh yeah, so just here's another example, right, with the central research question. So again, how did participation in the program impact participant self-efficacy to select healthy lunch options in the cafeteria? Can you imagine that you walked up to like an 11-year-old or like an 11th grader and asked them that question? They would be like, what? So then you can start to break it down for them when you're in the cafeteria for lunch. What are some of the things you consider when choosing what you'll what you will eat. How does your decision-making process about food choices now compare to before the program? For an 11th grader, that might not be appropriate, but we could figure out a better way to make that appropriate. How confident do you feel about your ability to select healthy foods from the cafeteria during lunch? How did that change from before to after, et cetera? So again, we have this central research question. We're trying to build towards that, not ask people about it.
Shaz, to make the same point again, notice the how. How did, how does, how confident. The process, that's very important.
Yeah, and what are some of the things that you consider? And
Yes.
again, I do drug research, not dietary self-efficacy. I have zero idea where this is, but it's very, no, I don't.
Okay. So, it's just the same thing, I think we have time, but another, a lead question, could you imagine, it's about, they're doing this, asking participants now that, they have cell phones and they have tracking technologies, they're giving people cell phones that can track where they go and how they feel about things. So they ask them, when you go through X, and you see a place where you used to buy drugs, how do you feel? That makes you want to use more drugs. Do you want to use more drugs now? And so on and so on. So it's I don't like that kind of research. And they pay, of course, because otherwise people wouldn't do anything. And the question is, could you imagine anything bad that could happen if you did this service 3 times a day for a week? And then you have people probably would say, yeah, no, because the money is good, whatever, right? So, and then you have the props there.
And I think the point of just showing this slide is it's just one way to set up a qualitative guide, right? But we've got this domain of interest, we've got a lead question. This one's particularly long, which is why we like the setup is really long, which is why now here's my question, right? Like trying to cue people into now I'm getting ready to ask you something. And then, few questions, many probes. And the hope is that you get people talking enough that the stuff in the probes comes out naturally. So you're really just trying to reflect on what you missed.
I noticed you set this up here, and on the left side it says domain, and then there's lead questions and probes. Is this the way you'd actually write your guide in front of you, physically? Or
Me, yeah.
I've seen it done in sequence, but anyway, please. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think there's all kinds of ways to do it. I normally don't have this on the vertical.
Yeah.
That's not true. I have this on the far left. I just ran out of room to make the slide look big, but I actually do like having domain, lead question, and probes, or at least when I design it, having the domain, and then if I take it into the field, it's easy to get rid of, right? I also think it's nice if you give some space on the side after lead question, probes, and maybe notes as you're going, so people aren't having to write on a piece of paper or at the end of the thing. But if it's a semi-structured guide, I happen to be like a sort of structured person, and so for me, I like it.
About the interview guide, it's not, you have to be consistent, right? So you have to ask all participants the same questions so you can compare the results. But at the same time, we told you that the research is interactive, and you change questions the more you learn, or if the situation changes, or if something, you have a new problem or redefine something. So it's a balance between, having a structure that you can compare and a set of questions that are applied to everybody, and then the need for change and accommodation and introducing new questions. There's some tension there, and also it's a guide. When you are asking people questions, you have to. I like the idea of sounding more as a conversation. Of course, it's not a conversation. They are responding to your question, and you are the person answering the questions. But the kind of environment I want to create is that of a conversation. So sometimes people might skip a question, or they don't know. They don't know where you're going. That's why you need an interview guide, right? So it guides them through the interview and tells them what you are looking for. But if somebody's already answering your question, don't ask them the same question. And that means that you have to be you have to pay a lot of attention to the flow of the conversation. If you have a survey, you just say age, gender, what marital status, and you just check. With a qualitative interview, you really have to be mindful of the flow of the conversation, whether they are bringing new themes, they are saying things you haven't expected. So you said, why is that? Or tell me more about that. And you really think, when you're telling them, tell me more about that, you really want to know more about that because it's something you haven't heard and you didn't know, or you need confirmation, or contradicts something that you thought you knew or you heard from other people. So it's a more engaging process. So your work is not done when you have the perfect interview guide. You revise, and then you adapt, and also you change. It's hard. Yeah,
and I and just speaking again to the importance of being in the field, right? Like the best way to improve your interview skills, I think, is to do interviews yourself, go through the very painful practice of just transcribing them yourself so you can hear all of the times in which you interrupted somebody, misdirected somebody, when you could have just shaken your head, right?
And your missed opportunities. You can say, I could have asked this. Oh, fine. You asked next person.
Yeah.
You asked the other person. You have 30, 40, 20, let's say whatever sample size you have. But you have to be involved, because if your research assistant is doing that and you're waiting 6 months to go through, it's too late. There's always missed opportunities, because you cannot be mindful of everything you are learning as you are going through this interview process, especially at the beginning. So it's a work in progress, and you have to be involved to have best results or better results.
I think, and one last thing to say about this is, like, as you guys are training your RAs, and you may know this, right, but you want to take a look at those transcripts to make sure, like, they talk, the participant talks. They talk, the participant talks, and I think that that's really key. The other thing is that, like, I think many of you will be recruiting from like community-based organizations or from linked social networks, and so people know each other. And being engaged in the data is a way to understand when like an adverse event has happened. So for like example, we did a study based out of a syringe services program. We operated on Wednesday nights. Lots and lots of women signed up for our study. Lots of women brought their friends to sign up for our study, and we knew that particular people were friends, right? Like, and they knew that their friends were in the study, but like that's their confidentiality to break, not ours. Mm-hmm. And so one of my RAs started talking with a participant about another participant, because that participant talked about them first. But like that's a breach of confidentiality. We ended up having to report that as like an adverse event, right? And so I think being engaged in the data allows you to identify particular like pitfalls or potential harms that can happen to your participants as a byproduct of being in your research.
So okay, you did all these interviews, all this great work. You have hundreds of pages of transcriptions, right? Now what? People contradict each other. In the same interview, somebody might say two different things. Maybe the framework was different, the question was framed different, maybe they were not paying enough attention, maybe, real life is complicated. So people can contradict each other, two people might contradict each other, or multiple people might have contradictory views, or just different views about stuff. So what do you do with hundreds of pages of stuff? It looks like chaos. It looks like a big bucket of you don't know what. So how do you bring order to the disorder? That's the coding. That coding is like exactly. I was thinking about a visual metaphor. You have a bucket, and all your data is on your bucket, big bucket. Content analysis is sorting this pile of data into smaller buckets so you can see what's out there and start understanding, the data, your findings, and the connection between different events and processes and variables. Mm-hmm. So you can use NVivo, MaxQDA. There's a lot of. It doesn't matter. The important thing to know is like the programs won't do the heavy lifting for you. It's a really great tool, but it's intellectual work. You have to think about the main themes, the connections. I'll tell you a little bit about this in a minute. The main thing is, like in my experience, overcoding is not good because you try to bring order to the disorder. You just need as little buckets as possible. If you have one big bucket and then you divide that into 300 buckets, meaning 300 codes, is it that helpful? Use a code book to ensure consistency. Yeah, that's important if you are coding in teams. I usually code alone. I like coding alone, not because I don't like supervision, but I like my data. I did the interviews. I know what's out there. I want to go through, and I'm very hands-on. On the other hand, independent coding enhances validity and reliability.
Mm-hmm. Just 2 quick points here. One, don't let a quantitative person tell you can't code alone, that you need a second person for reliability. Bullshit. I think that's really, really important. And then, I think the other thing is during analysis, like keep going back to your central research question and remind yourself, like, what is it that what's the meaning I'm trying to make here? Like, what's that thing that I'm trying to address? And if other things come up, like, great, then you've got cool new other side projects or things to consider or caveats, whatever. But I think just like returning to the question is just super important.
Yes.
And it's more about coding alone, just because I know that some reviewers, or at least I've been told, that you need to have that that you need to have that. They want not only to explain what the kappa is and your procedure for reconciling differences, and they're very.
I happen to me in some papers, but usually
You just cite all of
I don't
the
get
ethnography.
I don't get that. And if you think about, I'm an ethnographer. You think, let's say, Philippe Bourgois, In Search of Respect, or Dope Fiend, or more classical ethnographies. Did they code? They didn't fucking code. I mean, coding is new. These coding processes are new. If you think
such
about
a strong reaction
I
to
know.
it at the podium, and I just wanted to.
If you think about the big ethnographies or big classical sociological work, my advisor never coded. She had no idea what in vivo was.
I will pick a fight with those reviewers by saying you're incorrectly applying a technique that is inconsistent with the epistemological paradigm of qualitative work. Like
I think
right,
so.
like what they're doing is they're trying to impose a quantitative standard of rigor onto a qualitative process, which is a wholly different process.
Right.
What they're saying is, I only believe in the truthiness of your data.
Right.
If two people independently come up with the same solution, and an ethnographer or a qualitative person would say, I am an instrument of my analysis, and therefore you should come up with something different if you analyze the same data, because it's the experiential process of doing it that creates it.
No, I like
So,
what you're saying.
Yeah, I will not do it.
Maybe
and I
that's
will
not the right
also-
journal for you.
I think-
I know you want to publish in a top. Everybody wants to publish in a top journal. I had
Grant
those
writing even, I'm talking.
arguments.
Even writing the grant.
But I'll say it in my proposals, in my papers, we do not do this, and this is why.
Okay, good.
And when people do it in papers, I will tell them this is why it's not right. Like, it's not an appropriate standard. There are other ways that you can talk about rigor,
Internal validity.
and reliability,
thank you.
and
You know when you
qualitative
know-
work.
Sometimes you're reading a paper and you're going through the findings, and they say they're talking about barriers, and then you read the quote, and it's not about barriers, and it's like, that's bad coding, that's bad analysis. That's a bad, and finally a bad paper, right? So it doesn't happen often, but sometimes you're going even in a reputable journal. Sometimes it's like, wait, that quote is not about what the person says it's about. So that's bad analysis, that's bad coding. But if you read a paper that reads flawlessly and the data makes sense and resonates with things that you know and other people know, and internally, it's like, the coding, you don't think too much about the coding. You assume that, there's something with the coding. There's a black box of research. Nobody's gonna ever ask you for the code book or how you did the coding. It's your tool, it's your data analysis, it's your process. Let me just show you.
I think too there's a lot of really great articles now that actually say there's other quality measures in qualitative
Exactly.
research
Thank
than
you.
just
Yeah.
iterate. Or you can cite those. You can say, hey, these three huge qualitative researchers have all these other qualitative measures. Or you could say, you could have a little subsection that says quality measures. And
Yeah,
say,
I do
we
like that.
met, we discussed, we
It
had
turns
debates.
out that qualitative researchers do have standards
Right.
with
Yeah.
which to
Totally.
evaluate
Yeah, and
the
like-
validity of their work. It's
Yeah.
just when you're trying to get quanti people to think about it, they want these metrics.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not even like novel.
I
It's
also-
just like, let me point you to the
I think-
ethnographic literature from 50 years ago or 100 years ago to see
Yeah.
how
No, it seems like some of the.
trustworthiness,
Yeah, the-
transferability, there's a whole different, and the mixed methods literature has a good language for this. They have these like ways of translating, because that's what you do as a mixed methods person, is have to translate so much.
And I also think it's okay if two people, like, I train a bunch of students, I have a bunch of staff, and so like I often have people, like, we work on a code book together, and like our process is like 3 or 4 of us will code the same 4 transcripts. We use that to like come up with and iterate. Then I might step out. 2 people may, or 2 or 3 people may continue. They may then try to apply those same codes to like 1 or 2 transcripts, make sure everybody's applying the codes in sort of similar ways, and then people go on to work individually. But I've never reported those sort of reliability measures. I'm just transparent about what our process is.
And imagine the other concern I have with the CAPA is, what if you have an agreement less than 100%?
Mm-hmm.
Do you just leave it? You're like, well, we got, I had 2 people doing it, we got pretty close, so we just left it? No, like, you have to come to
The discussion is
agreement.
really important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to come to agreement. So anything less than 100% suggests you're not done,
Yeah.
to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a code book, that's a guide, it's just an example of perceived risk as a code. I also like to include in this code book an example that illustrates the perceived risk.
Oh, that's better.
Yeah, the risk of, using heroin in times of fentanyl is that I might die. So that's perceived risk, right? So the person says the risk is that I might die, or they just said I might die, and it adds, how a code looks like when you are coding. Yeah, that's an example, and but it's.
I also think that it's important, so I just made up this application rule on the train up, but when somebody doesn't say the thing, when the expectation is that there will be risk and that you're finding that there is no risk, that's also a finding, right? That null finding is exceptionally important. So you may want to keep that in the code of perceived risks and then code for that and then come back to that. And so I think those kinds of application rules, especially when you're working in teams, can be really, really important.
Let me show you. That's it. Yeah, I think it looks better there than it looks in the screen because it's tiny. I had this project about barriers to treatment in rural Nebraska during COVID. So barriers to treatment and during COVID. So you can see the main, I could just code it initially barriers, right, to treatments. But then you had hundreds of codes. So I said, looking at financial issues, disability, disagreement over norms. On this hand, you see how many codes you have. So never offer treatment 13. So 13 people or 13 times on 13 occasions, people said never offer. Then you have 40 mental health issues. So 40 codes identify mental issues as a barrier. It gives you an indication, a quantitative indication of relevance of how many people said something about that particular code. 3, not very important. Fear of withdrawal. It guides you like that. You can start with barriers, and then as you read through the codes, you can start refining and revising. You can move things up and up. You can merge them. You can divide them, subdivide them. So it's very you start thinking more the more you look at the data. This is just about mental health as a barrier, and it says I don't think I made it through the first week of treatment if I hadn't started it. And it's talking about Seroquel and how Seroquel was interfering with the treatment. The person was taken out of Seroquel, and then the person was able to remain in treatment. So it shows you this one here, that particular code there. Yes, it makes sense. It's Seroquel, it's mental health there. Transportation issues are important, insurance issues are important, failed drug tests are also important. You can move things, and the important thing is coding does that. They just sort chunks of data and lumps them together, but then you have to do this intellectual work of thinking about what does it mean, the connections between barriers and mental health, the connection between health disparities and mental health and treatment, and bringing the theory, bringing the theoretical framework, bringing the problem, bringing the question into the analysis. You have a priori and emerging themes. A priori are your own codes, the codes you want to code for. I wanted to code for barriers because that was my research question. Most of the codes here are a priori codes that I wanted to code for. I usually, it's not that I don't care about emerging themes. If I see emerging themes, I usually code for that. But my initial response when I start coding, of course, is start coding from my research question and my research and the variables that I really care about. I also wanted to code for COVID, so there's a big thing about COVID in coding here. And I also wanted to write a paper about drug markets and the effect of COVID-19 on drug markets. So I coded for drug markets initially, and then separated drug markets and drug supply into price, access, and quality. So those are codes that I refined later. I started like drug markets and then ended up at these 3 different sub codes. Just an example. It's not, you can code different ways. I can go back tomorrow and probably code differently as well. But the main thing is not to overcode. You see, there's 20, 30, probably 30 codes overall. I did 40 interviews. I mean, these are not hundreds of interviews, but I don't feel I overcode for anything. You can, each line could be a code if you overcode.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do that.
How often would you say you read each transcript?
I did the interview, so I have a lot of ideas of what's in there already, but at least a couple of times. One initially, to sort I don't read them all. I read like 5, 6, 7 interviews to think about the main. In addition to the a priori teams I have, I'm looking for emerging teams there and trying to confirm the relevance of the a priori teams that I think I have. I want to see them across all the interviews, looking for emerging teams there, and I start, building my coding tree from this initial 3, 4, 7, 8 interviews that I read 2 or 3 times, and then probably once. And then once you have the code, I want to read particular code. So I go there and read again and look, if I'm thinking about mental health and as a barrier, I want to read everything, every one of the codes that I manufacture or I produce or identify to make sure that actually they are what they're saying they are, and also to start thinking about the connections and the narrative emerging from the coding, because that's the second part. Remember, these programs only sort things out, but what it means for your research question, for the evidence you need to collect, that's your intellectual work. You have to think about that, because the program only sorts things out and allows you for a easy visualization, but that's it. I like coding. I think it gives you this hands-on approach on data and allows visualization of patterns and themes. Classic anthropologists didn't do it, and they did amazing work. There's different ways of doing things,
Do you do your so that second stage,
yes,
the kind of sense-making stage, do you also do that in your software?
I take a look of all the categories, but then I do charts, I do charts, I do connections, and I'm a very manual person, and not very technological, so I know there are ways of doing it in vivo, charting and skimming. I just get a piece of paper. I said, okay, barriers, this barrier leads to this, and this leads to this, and ties to this, and start building like that this second level of analysis.
I always have to do that second level on paper.
Well,
I can get it this far in the box, and then I have to print it out.
Well, we do the same thing. I'm sure, maybe it's I don't want to say an age thing, because, but in my case, I think I like paper. I like hands-on stuff. And I like going through different, research is manual, but also intellectual. So don't think a software program would solve your issues. You have to be mindful of what are you doing and why are you doing it first. If you know what you're coding for, you code well. If you don't know, you overcode and you have more mess at the end.
Yeah. So Adele Clark, who trained in the grounded theory and Strauss tradition, tells her students, you have to get down on the floor and roll around in your data.
Yeah, literally, you can totally do that. You can print stuff.
I put it in.
Yes.
In the old days, we didn't have this. You used to cut it up and tape it on the wall.
That's how people used to do it. You have to find what works for you also, right? So these things work for me. Some are standard practice, but you have to find your own pace, the kind of things that work for you, the kind of skills that you can able to bring. It's personal, because at the end of the day, qualitative research, you are the tool of data collection. It's you collecting, analyzing the data. So you have to think about what works for you, what is practical, what is possible. Let me just go through.
I think also code occurrence isn't the biggest analytical quality measure. So like all 50 participants, all 30 or 15 participants might have said something, but that doesn't mean that it's salient. So like if 5 people said it, but it really connects back to your research question, and it really is a salient sort of theme, then that is really beneficial too.
Right.
Totally. I don't want to monopolize this.
Oh no, I was just sort of thinking the same thing. So remember back to yesterday when David was talking about sort of as an adjunct to your study, we went off on a tangent. But let's go back to the tangent, right? The tangent was that somebody in a study identified something, right? Like a research assistant was noticing that research participants didn't understand the consent process, right? I think that was it, right? And so there was this idea that and if your question is about like what causes moral distress to research assistants, well, like, Jesus, can you imagine you've got somebody going through some kind of clinical trial and they realize that the participant has zero idea what they just signed up for. Faith was noting that something similar could happen in like genetic-based research. Remember back to Henrietta Lack. Like, it's the fact that one person said that, I think, is absolutely important and could drive you to sort of either realize like, this is really critical, I'm going to write about it as like not a fully explored theme, or it's so important that I'm going to do some more research because I want to try and understand this thing that was generated by just one person, because like I, as an investigative tool, think that like lack of understanding of informed consent is like really, really important. So I think, again, to your point, like one person saying it doesn't mean it's not important.
Oh, no. One person said it, one person might have this unusual understanding of things. They're like intellectuals, right? Public intellectuals, people that can articulate to us what's going on. There's very smart people using drugs, as we know, and some of them can really put things together in a way that encapsulates what you know but cannot, right there, like, oh, shit. So perfect, the perfect quote, the perfect understanding, the perfect thing that you need for the paper, and more importantly for the understanding of the situation. Mm-hmm. I wrote about a book about the guinea pigs, professional guinea pigs, people testing drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, in phase 1 trials. And when I was asking them, what's the experience? Tell me about the experience of being a paid volunteer. They're called paid volunteers, but are just workers being exploited by the pharmaceutical industry. And he said, it's like the mild torture economy. You are being paid to suffer. It's like security guard that is being paid to do nothing, to pretend he's working and watching, but actually not doing much. The same thing with a professional volunteer, like phase 1 trial. Mild torture economy. They are paying you for your suffering, for your pain, and from the discomfort. And that was, many people were saying it's discomfortable, it's exploitative, but he said the mild torture thing. And it's like, I think it's brilliant that the capitalist system and the pharmaceutical industry is mildly torturing not just professional subjects, but I think everybody. So it's like, amazing quote, right? So you have to, one person said that and encapsulates, as you said, right? So that means that you have to pay attention to detail, that you have to pay attention to everything. But if you miss things, don't worry about it, because usually it's social practice. Most people would say it, most people would think about it. Some people would say it in a stronger word or in a better way, but it's so they're all living the same lives in similar situations. So themes are going to come up, and that's why we do the analysis, because we know there's rationality there and there are patterns that would emerge. So don't stress too much, and that's my conclusion in doing qualitative research. Prepare, be mindful, be thoughtful. But if you miss something, a question, you ask the next person. If you miss an interview, you ask the next person, you think again, you ask again. You can go back. The people won't go anywhere, usually, right? Unless they overdose and die or migrate, whatever. You can always go back. So it's interactive, really interactive. You screw up the first time, go back, do better next time. It's a process.